across the fence, we're tracking the beautiful but elusive bobcat. We'll learn about bobcats' habitat, health, and hunting prowess. Good afternoon and thanks for joining us. I'm Judy Simpson. The eastern bobcat is common throughout most of Vermont, but it's rarely seen. There are two main reasons for the lack of bobcat sightings. The cats are solitary by nature, and they're generally most active at dawn and dusk. But this afternoon, you're going to get a chance to see bobcats in the wild, thanks to technology involving a remote camera. And we're fortunate to have Vermont's leading expert on bobcats with us this afternoon. I want to welcome Kim Royer. Kim is a veteran wildlife biologist with the Vermont Department of Fish and Wildlife and the former leader of the state's Fur Bearer Project. Well, thanks so much for coming in.
Thanks for having me, Judy.
So is the bobcat native to Vermont?
It is, yes. It's one of 3 native felids to Vermont and is actually the most common one in Vermont and actually across the country as well.
Are there other wildcats in Vermont?
There are. There is the lynx, which was a very rare cat and still is relatively rare. It's on the endangered species list. And mountain lions were also native to Vermont, but we believe are extirpated right now. So the bobcat is the remaining common cat.
It's funny because just this morning we got something from the Vermont Fish and Wildlife Department saying that a lynx has been spotted in southern Vermont, which is pretty exciting.
It's very exciting because we have had some sightings in the last 10 or 15 years in the Northeast Kingdom, but we had a sighting last spring in Londonderry, and then also last spring a photo that was sent to us very recently of a lynx crossing under Route 9, which was an underpass that we'd actually worked with V-Trans to put in for wildlife crossing. So that was really exciting. So
tell me a little bit about what we know about the current population of bobcats in Vermont.
Well, they're common and abundant. We have bobcats pretty much throughout the state. They're an animal that uses forested habitat primarily. Does not like habitat that's been converted to fields or to development. So they primarily use forests and scrub habitat and wetlands.
So now we see a map here. What is this?
So this is a map that's based on a study that we did in the early 2000s. It was with UVM Cooperative Research Unit. We had a graduate student that collared cats. And these are dots from a cat that has been collared that were collected on a GPS collar. And it shows you the kind of landscape use that that particular cat used.
That's just one cat?
That's one cat traveling across the landscape. And you can see that it's using the forested habitat. The darker green area is all forested habitat. The lighter green is mostly fields.
It's really avoiding the fields.
It really seems to be avoiding the fields, and that's what this study showed.
And so here's another picture. What are we looking at?
So this is a different cat. This sort of shows you the extent of the home range and how large an area that cat will travel. Covering several different towns. This is another photo of a different cat that shows how they'll use stream corridors for moving across the landscape. There's a stream that runs through there, and that's how it's crossing the road, is actually using the scrub-shrub habitat on either side of the stream or the forested habitat.
Tell me a little bit about the bobcats' habitat.
So this study actually, the reason we did it was to determine whether there were any critical habitats for bobcats. And what we found was that they use wetlands heavily. They use those stream corridors very heavily. They will use rocky ledges as denning sites and refugia from other types of animals and people. And also because the exposure in those rocky ledges is often south or west facing, and it's much warmer than in other places. And they use forested habitats in general.
Now you mentioned, we mentioned earlier that they usually travel dawn or dusk.
Right, they're most active at dawn or dusk or during the night. And we actually would program those cameras, those collars, so that we got the points during dawn and dusk. And they'll actually travel faster through poor quality habitat.
Really?
Yes.
Poor quality habitat for them.
For them, exactly. So if they're trying to get from one place to another and it's habitat that's been converted to field or development, there's a little brushy area between, like a hedgerow, they'll use that hedgerow to move, but actually they'll move at a faster pace than they do in regular forested habitat or wetland habitat.
Now, do they climb trees?
They do climb trees, yes.
Tell me a little bit about that. Will they?
They have retractable claws, just like a domestic cat, and they're good climbers. They mostly hunt on the ground, but they will also climb trees.
And what's a bobcat's keenest sense?
Mostly it uses its eyes and its ears. Just like a domestic cat, they have very large eyes, and they're very attracted to movement, and so they stalk.
And as you could see in that video, he was walking and there was an open space, so he was definitely staying close enough to the woods. So.
Right, and he feels comfortable there because of the woods on either side.
And so are bobcats known to be aggressive? I mean, do you have to worry about them?
No, not. They're very secretive. I've actually had collared cats within maybe 3 to 5 feet of me that I couldn't see because it was so brushy, and that cat never came anywhere near me. So they'll run from us if possible. The only times we've ever had interactions with people is we've had a few rabid cats that will get very weird acting.
So that's a good heads up for people if they see a bobcat and it's not afraid of you.
That's right.
It could be
then something's
wrong
probably wrong. Unless you're a turkey hunter all dressed in camo, and sometimes they'll be calling a turkey and the bobcat doesn't realize that it's actually a human instead of a turkey, and it might approach pretty closely.
So what's the reproductive cycle of the bobcat?
They generally mate February to March or April, and they have a 2-month gestation period, so the kittens are born anywhere from April to June. The kittens, they have den sites, and the female actually stays with the kittens for quite a long time. The kittens tend to leave the den sites in about 6 weeks, 4 to 6 weeks.
Mm-hmm. And the male is no longer in the picture.
Right, the male does not help much at all.
How big do they get?
The females are smaller than the males. The males tend to be quite a bit larger. Females may weigh 15 to 18 pounds. Males can get up to 40 pounds, a large one.
And you mentioned, too, that they can actually take down a deer.
They can, actually. We've done some food studies on bobcats back in the 40s, so it was a long time ago. But I think 30-some-odd% of the stomach contents was deer. But they also generally will focus on snowshoe hare, cottontail rabbits, and small mammals.
And so I know in my own yard, I haven't seen a bobcat. My kids have seen one years ago, but there are traces, bits and pieces of bunnies every once in a while, and I'm just wondering if that's what that is.
It's possible, but there's also many other, there's fisher that will take rabbits, there's foxes that will take rabbits, coyotes that take rabbits. So rabbits are kind of like the ubiquitous prey species for everything that's out there. So
now when do these animals develop their coats? Because their fur is really beautiful.
Right. Well, they're prime, what's called prime in the wintertime usually. So in the summer, just like a domestic dog or cat, the coats get much thinner, and then as they get into the colder periods, then the coats will get much thicker, especially the underfur gets very thick, and the guard hairs get very long and beautiful.
Now, you brought a couple of examples to
show us.
I did,
yes. I wanted to show folks the difference between a bobcat and a lynx, because we get a lot of sightings. People think they've seen a lynx when they're just seeing a very large bobcat. So the things that people need to look for, this is a bobcat right here, and this is a lynx. And the things that we want people to check is the difference in the tails. So this is the bobcat with the white tip.
Oh, okay.
The top of the tail is black, but the bottom of the tail is white. And that white is very obvious most of the time, whereas a lynx has an all-black tip. Okay. Very distinctive feature. And another thing to look for, which is a little harder to describe because it's a little subjective, but this is the foot of a bobcat. And this is a foot of the lynx. And you can see the lynx is adapted to deep, fluffy snow. The bobcat's at the northern edge of its range here in Vermont and does not do well in deep, fluffy snow. And that's because its foot is so much smaller. It can't stay on top of the snow as well as a lynx can.
Got it.
So those are two of the features that we hope people will look for when they're trying to distinguish between one or the other.
And the lynx are larger than the bobcat.
They may look larger because their legs are longer generally. They may not weigh as much. If you have a large male bobcat, it can actually weigh more than a female lynx. But they do look larger because they're fluffier and their tails are longer.
So does the bobcat have a natural predator?
Besides man, probably the natural predator in this day and age is fisher. A great horned owl might take a kitten at some point, but mostly it's starvation or disease that will kill bobcats.
They mentioned the fisher. Are there a lot of fisher in Vermont?
There are. Fisher's native as well, but it was reintroduced in the 1950s and 60s to actually control the porcupine population.
Oh, really?
Yeah, they were brought in by the Forest and Parks Department. And so they actually are also very common and abundant now.
And they're more aggressive, though, aren't they?
They can be more aggressive. I mean, these are all predators, so if you're a prey species, they're aggressive.
Now, is there a bobcat hunting or trapping season?
There is. Actually, bobcat were bountied from the mid-1800s up until 1971, because back then people's perception of any of these large predators were that they would take cattle or sheep or domestic animals. So they were bountied, and the bounty was removed in 1971, and a much more restricted season was established in 1976. So there's a small, short 2-week trapping season right now, and a month-long hunting season in the winter, January, February.
And about how many cats are taken?
For a long time, there was the average was about 30. We're up to maybe about 100 now.
Mm-hmm. And what's the population like now?
Well, we don't have an actual population estimate, but we had, through that study that we did, we were able to establish some home range sizes and extrapolate. So maybe between 1,500 and 2,500. It's very general, and we really don't try to nail ourselves down to that because we don't have good figures for that.
Right. What challenges do bobcats face in Vermont and northern New England?
Well, part of the reason why we did the study is because we had concerns about habitat fragmentation and forest fragmentation. As you could see from some of those visuals, they are tied to the forest or to scrub shrub, and if that gets converted to something else, developments or roads, then it makes bobcat movement across the landscape much harder. And they do move long distances. The male's home ranges might be 27 square miles.
Wow.
So they need connected habitats and good forest blocks.
Can we take another look at those pelts too? Because I understand that the ears as well are a
Right.
big telltale sign of which is which.
They can be, and actually I don't have very good tufts on these ears. You can see here's a little tuft, here's a tuft on the lynx ear.
Mm-hmm.
But the bobcats have
eyebrows.
tufts too.
Mm-hmm.
The lynx tend to have longer tufts than the bobcat, but when I ask somebody, did it have tufts? Were they long? It's hard for somebody to tell.
Right,
when
unless you
they've
have
seen
them
it.
sitting
That's
side
right,
by side.
exactly, yes, yeah.
And that probably would never happen.
Right, it's hard, it's hard, that's right. It doesn't happen in the wild.
So what else do you want Vermonters to know about bobcats?
Well, I think, again, that they are a common and abundant species. They're not at risk. The population is not at risk. But they do require intact habitat, habitat that has blocks that are connected by vegetated areas of riparian areas of streams that have forests on either side.
Mm-hmm. And so you mentioned in studies that you've done with collaring some of these animals, are there plans to do more studies, more research on them?
Probably not in the near future. Those are very expensive, and we got the kind of information that we needed in order to protect bobcats and their habitats for the time being. So probably we'll transfer. We're doing work on lynx right now.
Mm-hmm. And so, as we mentioned, there was one sighting in southern Vermont. What happens after that? Once the Fish and Wildlife Department puts out one of those statements saying we've seen these rare animals,
Right.
What happens?
Well, we actually have been doing some work in the Northeast Kingdom in the last few years. We've got trail cameras out. We've been doing track count surveys in the wintertime in cooperation with a bunch of partners. Just to try to monitor what's happening with that population. We'd send out the press release so people will let us know if they see lynx, because that's one way for us to also track what's happening with the population. So that's the kind of thing that will start. And eventually, if the population grew, Maine did an extensive radio collar study on their lynx as their population expanded so that they could learn more about the habitat needs of the animal.
Is there a thought that maybe this particular animal came from Maine originally?
Yes, in fact, that's a really important point, is that lynx in particular need that connectivity between Maine, New Hampshire, Vermont, and Canada. Mm-hmm. And so maintaining those large forest blocks and the habitat connectors that keep us linked up to other states and other countries is really important in the future of these populations. And climate change is going to have an effect on lynx as well.
You think so?
Yeah, bobcats are probably going to do better because they're at the northern edge of their range. Lynx are going to have problems as the snow depths get less.
Right, because they really, as you mentioned earlier, depend on the heavy snow.
To outcompete bobcats and fisher and other animals like that.
All right, well, thank you so much for joining us today. This has been a really interesting talk.
Oh, great. Well, thank you for having me.
If folks see one of these animals, should they call your department?
Especially a lynx. If they think they've seen a lynx, they should definitely give us a call. We'd be very interested.
Okay, thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you.
That's our program for today. I'm Judy Simpson. We'll see you again next time on Across the Fence.